am Beth Durodoye, and I am a professor of counseling with a specialization in multicultural counseling. And I'm very excited this morning to be able to speak to the topic of cultural considerations for teacher effectiveness. We have two objectives for this morning. The first is to understand how cultural dynamics influence our interactions in the college classroom. And second, we want to identify various teaching methods that support culturally diverse students in our classrooms. I want to remind everyone that we want or we don't want to treat cultural norms as absolutes, or we go about the route of stereotyping. So we want to make tentative generalizations and treat these generalizations as probabilities and not certainties, as McAuliffe states. I'm going to ask for you all's help on this section. And I want you all to give me an idea of what you think culture is. So we'll do a little shout-out activity, and I'm going to write the information down as you all highlight it for me. But if I ask the question, what is culture? What would you say? What is culture? Okay. Traditions? Okay. Uh-huh.
The group where you find your social identity that you connect the most with.
Okay, the group you connect most with. Okay, norms.
Expression through art. Nonverbal communication.
All right. Oh, that's got people excited to hear. All right. Okay. Language. Way of life.
Symbols.
Symbols, like what type of symbols?
Religion symbols.
Pardon me?
Religion symbols.
Say that one more time.
Religion symbols.
Religious.
Country of origin.
Country of origin.
Family ties.
Family ties.
What's taboo?
Uh-huh. Taboo subjects.
Behavior.
Behavior. Nationality, okay.
Needs, legends.
Okay, all right. Religion, yes, we had that a little earlier. Religion and then religious symbols.
Experiences.
Experiences, okay, so your personal. Family, okay. Someone said regional. Okay, so geographic locale and what that might mean for different groups. Okay. How about just a few last ones?
Clothing, fashion.
Okay, clothes.
Values.
Pardon me?
Values.
Values. And how about one more? Someone said language. Okay, we had that. And then we had also
Accent.
yes, language, accent, so all that would go into, for example, verbal and nonverbal communication. All right, so again, we have quite a big list here. I think you all heard each other call this information out, and I would say that in terms of what was listed, all of this would fall into the area of culture. It is a huge umbrella term. As a matter of fact, I like to use the definition by Paulo Freire, who is a renowned educator, who states that culture is anything that people make. Okay? Culture is anything that people make. So again, everything that you all have highlighted, you will find under that definition. Now we want to look at culture a little bit more specifically, and I'm going to use the metaphor of an iceberg. Okay, so culture as an iceberg. And what this does is to look at levels of awareness that people have about their own culture, for example, as well as the culture of others. And you'll find that the tip of the iceberg is going to represent the part of culture that is known, the part that is blatant, if you will. And then the part underneath the water, which is the even larger part, contains what people don't know, but what influences them at the same time. Okay, so culture is very large. Okay? So that tip of the iceberg would be considered surface culture. Okay? And some of these areas persons have already called out when we started talking about examples of culture. So these are the things that you can see. For example, the dress, what people wear. And depending on what cultures individuals come from, it may vary, and dress may have certain meanings for certain groups of people. The foods that we eat, again, the same thing. There's some things that people might eat in one culture that people might want to avoid in another culture, okay? But that's, again, very upfront. The same with music, for example, okay? So different instruments for different cultures have different meanings, different sounds, different beats, so forth and so on. So that would be considered what we call surface. Okay? Now, deep culture is that part underneath that is more ambiguous and that, again, we may not see, but that does influence us. So that when we talk about gender roles, you know, for any group, for any population, for any culture, what does it mean to be a male in that culture? How do we figure that out? What does it mean, for example, to be a female in that culture? How do we figure that out? All right. Another example, patterns of superior and subordinate relationships. Okay, so that when we talk about hierarchies in any one culture, you know, how do we figure out who is in charge and who's not in charge, and the behaviors that we need to play to that person who might be in charge or not? Okay, how do we figure out all of these kinds of roles? And then the ways that we handle emotions, you know, that can be something too. That again, you may have to be very much involved in any one culture before you can understand truly what that means. For example, here in the United States, mainstream culture, when we talk about being happy, you know, many times people might say that, you know, I can see that because you're smiling. Okay, but for another culture, for some in Vietnamese culture, for example, a smile may not necessarily mean that you're happy. It may mean that you're wary. It may even mean that you're somewhat angry. So again, understanding what that deep culture means and what affect means for people from different backgrounds. Okay, so another way to think about culture. Now, when we talk about, you know, dealing with all of this in the classroom, we always have to talk about competencies, diversity competencies, which are very important. So we have to be able to negotiate around these three areas. And we're talking about awareness, we're talking about knowledge, and we're talking about skills. Okay, so in this particular case, we're talking about our cross-cultural teaching skills. Personal awareness, again, information that we need to know about ourselves before we can then go out and effectively work with those who are ethnically or culturally different from ourselves. Cultural knowledge, knowledge about various groups that we may be interacting with in the classroom. And then again, these teaching skills that will be very important for us. Okay? So we're going to take each of these in turn, and we're going to start off with the area of personal awareness. And just to reiterate, again, I am one who does believe that before we can go out and work effectively with those who are culturally or ethnically different from ourselves, we need to know who we are. And so that's why I have here the saying of teacher, know thyself. You're going to come into your classroom with all of your values, with all of your beliefs, with all of your biases, for example, and so are your students. But as the persons in the classroom who do have most of the responsibility, we want to make sure that we are doing all that we can in order to avoid assumptions. Okay? So we have to be able to know what areas might make us a little more tense when we talk about multicultural or cross-cultural or working with culturally diverse persons. What areas are we most comfortable in dealing with, okay? So that we, again, avoid issues in our classroom that can create barriers. So what I've done here is just put up some examples of things that can happen in classrooms, but we have to make sure that we work to avoid some of them. For example, students associated with a particular group or thinking that students associated with a particular group are experts on that group and want the class to consider them beacons of knowledge, okay? So for example, you only have one male student in your class, and then you might say something to the effect of, well, you're the only man here, let's have your opinion on this particular topic. And everyone turns to that one student, and he's expected to know everything about males and how they would think, feel, and act with regards to that particular area of study. So that can lead to some discomfort. You want to make sure that you avoid that. Sometimes in classes that I teach dealing with, for example, multicultural counseling, there can be a thought that, when we're talking about these issues of culture, white individuals won't have anything to say. They're not part of the conversation, just ethnic minority people are. And that is not true. Everyone has a part to play, has a voice in talking about these issues. So you have to make sure you're inclusive and are inviting everyone to participate. Thinking students from particular backgrounds can't write, okay? So you might get someone who writes on a paper, you write very well for a Mexican student, okay? Now, yet things like this happen, so that's why we want to avoid them, okay? So this can create a problem in your classroom. Stay away from things like that. Students from particular groups are more likely to be combative or not participate in class discussions, or have a radical agenda. Again, if first day of class, someone walks into your room, they have on a certain type of clothing or a certain hairstyle, it's like, a teacher might think, uh-oh, I'm gonna have trouble with that one. How do you know? Just because someone is wearing something or looking a particular way, avoid those kinds of assumptions. Also, there are persons who think that, if we have older students in our classrooms, we're going to have to spend a whole lot of time trying to help them to figure things out because they're slow. And they're not going to know how to do this or how to do that. And I just don't feel like having to spend that extra time with them because they're not going to understand. The same thing for working with persons with disabilities. There may be that type of thinking. So again, be very careful about the assumptions that you make, again, because we want everyone to be able to benefit from what you are teaching in the classroom. So in terms of just some tips or some quick teaching implications, of course, the first one, avoid assumptions, but also, and we'll talk about this coming up in just a few minutes, being aware of who you are and being aware of all of your identities. For example, I'm African American, female of a certain age, so forth and so on. Being aware of all of that and the dynamics that that can play in a classroom. Also, you need to know your limitations, okay? And a lot of people think that, if I have limitations, that's an embarrassment. That's something bad. But I consider that to be a strength, okay? If you know what you need to work on, if you know how you need to go about working on it, that is something that's positive. So you have to constantly work to challenge any prejudices that you might have, any negative thoughts, beliefs, so forth that you might have. Very important to do. And then lastly, to remember not to personalize when sensitive issues might come up in your classroom. And I know that this is very easy to say, it's right here, very quick, so forth and so on, but it can be very, very difficult to do. For example, many years ago, I was teaching a class, and it happened to be a multicultural counseling course, and out of nowhere, we weren't even talking about this particular issue. A student jumped up and said, you're nothing but an affirmative action hire. I don't have to listen to you. And, in my heart, I didn't know what to do. I was stunned, I was upset, I was mad, and I thought, all of the things went through my head about what I could do, to what I wanted to do to this student who had, done this to me in the front of the class. The only thing I did do, however, was to simply ask her, what would make you say something like that? Because to, get involved in the emotions of that at that time would not be productive. It would take us off track in terms of what we were to be learning in the classroom, and it just was not the time. Should that type of behavior had continued, then I would have asked her either to step out of the class, come to see me, so forth and so on, but not to personalize it and get involved in a fight in the classroom that's not going to help anyone there, okay? So again, very easy to say, but it can be very, very difficult to do. So we want to think about these particular areas as we're looking at that point of personal awareness. Next is the area of cultural knowledge. Having information about the various groups that you may be working with in your classroom. Okay? And I'd like to use Pamela Hayes's addressing model, just to help us to keep in mind all the parts of an individual that we're dealing with. Yes, I tend to deal with ethnic issues, racial issues, but that's not all. Color is not all there is to a person. There are all these other dimensions that we need to keep in mind as well. So, for example, we have A standing in for age. Okay? We have the D's standing in for both developmental and acquired disabilities. R for religious and spiritual orientation. And again, we have to remember as well that you may have students who have no belief system, who are atheist or who are agnostic, for example. Ethnic and racial identity is the E. The S stands for one's socioeconomic status. Sexual orientation, we keep that in mind as well. Pamela Hayes talks about indigenous heritage as being persons who are Native Americans or persons who are Aleuts from Alaska, for example. Okay, so First Nations people is how she will define that. We have to keep in mind the area of national origin. If we're dealing with immigrants, if we're dealing with refugees, if we're dealing with international students, that information could be contained here. And we can talk about language diversity here as well. Okay? And then lastly, the area of gender. Okay? So keeping that in mind as we're working with various populations. For example, if we're working in a class with adult learners or even older adult learners, to understand that as we age, there might be some changes in the way that we're reading material, seeing material, so forth and so on. So we might want to think about when we're using PowerPoints to use a font of a particular size, perhaps 14 point font, for example, or we want to make sure that we're not using colors that blend together. The writing is blending together with the background colors of our PowerPoints because it's harder for the older eye to distinguish between the two, okay? So things like that can be helpful as we're thinking about working with particular populations. With regards to UTSA, we need to be aware that our university has been designated by the Department of Education as a Hispanic and minority serving institution. Okay, so given that, it would behoove us to have more information about Hispanic students as well as minority students, because these students can experience some things differently than others, also can experience things the same as well. But when we talk about cultural stressors that may come into play, you can have people who might feel alone. You can have people who might feel isolated, okay? You might have individuals who are first-generation college students and have certain needs that others may not necessarily have. You might also find people experiencing what we call the imposter syndrome. And that's, wondering, I'm here, but how did I get here? Am I really supposed to be here? Do I really belong here? Do I need to stay here? And then what do we have to do as educators to help them through that and to know that, yes, they are part of this community. You also run into situations where in the classroom people might be reluctant to participate in a class for various reasons because of cultural expectations. And I'll talk about this a little bit more when we talk about language, but people being reluctant to speak up in class if you're from a culture that says you don't do that, versus the expectation here in the United States that wants us to be involved, wants us to critically analyze information, wants us to challenge the teacher, for example, and not to think that that person doesn't want to be a part of class or is distancing himself or herself from the class, when it can be truly just a cultural situation that we have to be aware of if we're understanding of that person's background. Okay? So again, this information is given so that we understand that we're not just dealing with one dimension of an individual, but we're dealing with several dimensions. Okay? All right. Of course, it takes some time to learn about our students and where they're coming from. And in order to do this, I think it helps us to build that, what we call rapport in the classroom, and build those relationships with our students. So asking students to, conduct like brief introductions can be very helpful to get a community built in your classroom. To ask people to write, there are different techniques, autobiographies, brief or long, to have discussions around those. Helps you to get a perspective about where your student is coming from and lets them know that their voice is being heard as well in the classroom. Okay? Very important here is to be able to check your communication style. And when we talk about communication style here, we're talking about both verbal and nonverbal behaviors and communication, excuse me. So we'll start off with verbal communication, and I'll give just a few examples that we need to be attentive to, because I've run into these kinds of situations in the classroom. It's very important to know basic terms for various populations of people. Sometimes people will say, well, what do I call black people? I mean, is it black? Is it African American? And then when I'm talking about other groups, is it Latino or is it Hispanic? Or just what am I supposed to say? And again, just to know and be politically correct is very important, to be sensitive. For African Americans, for example, you can use both African American and black. They are going to have some different meanings. Black is a broader term because everyone who is black is not necessarily African American. All right, so we have to be aware of that and know some of the differences there. But again, that is not necessarily going to always work for everyone. I've had people who say, I don't want to be called black because that's just a color. I'm like, okay. And then you have persons, you say African American, and it's like, I was born in Detroit. I don't know anything about Africa. I'm like, okay. All right, so you just, just kind of check with the individual if that should come up in your classroom, if, just check and see what that individual might want to be called. And some people just say, call me by my name. That doesn't even matter to me. Okay, just call me by my name, and that's okay. All right, so that's something to think about. Also, in terms of labeling, we want to make sure, for example, that we refer to women as women and not girls. That I've heard this said too, that we don't use the word Oriental for a person. Okay, Oriental is a thing. Oriental is a rug. Oriental is food. Asian is a person. Okay, so be aware of some of those distinctions. In the handout that I had for you from Paul Gorski, one of the first things that he talked about in terms of 20 critical things that we can do to be more equitable as educators, he stated first that we learn to pronounce every student's name correctly. And that's a big deal, okay? Very big deal. So if we can do that, that can be very beneficial and can take us a long way in the classroom. For example, my last name is Durodoye. And if you don't see it written out, it can be hard to pronounce. And when people check with me to find out how to do that, that's wonderful. But if I'm coming to class every day, or every other day, or every week, and someone's calling me something other than that, that starts to get on my nerves. And I'm thinking, maybe that person's not caring. Maybe that person really doesn't know who I am or doesn't even want to know who I am, just to check with me. I've had people who've called me, doo-doo. Now, the first time, that can be cute, okay, and I'll laugh with you. But if you keep calling me that every time I see you, that's not going to work. Okay, so take some time to learn the names of your students and ask them if you're having trouble about how to pronounce their names, okay? And then we also have this area of nonverbal communication that we have to pay attention to. And let's see, there are different parts that fall under here. One is that point of personal space. And in general, we know that African Americans and Latinos, tend to stand closer to one another when in conversation and when talking. And this is not necessarily the case when we're talking about, for example, white Americans, so that you can see how that might create some uncomfortableness depending on how close or not your students are standing to you, so forth and so on, and understanding that this may be a cultural situation that we're dealing with. The other nonverbal communication point that's often brought up is that area of eye contact. And many times we know that for some persons and some cultures, looking at someone directly in the eye is considered disrespectful. It's considered threatening. And so you might find some students don't do that. They might look down all the time. That doesn't mean that they're disengaged from the process or that they don't care. That could be simply from their culture. The thought is, I can't do that or I'll be, disrespectful to the teacher. Whereas in mainstream culture here in the United States, generally the thought is that in order to show me in the classroom that you're engaged and that you're following along and that you're with me and that we're connected in some way, people will kind of nod their heads or they might smile or they might look at me, straight in the eye to show me I'm there, and that's what we have, or some people have become used to. So if someone does something differently, that can create a problem when it's not necessarily so. I know that dealing with older, for example, Native American individuals, we can have situations whereby people are looking down, they have their arms crossed, and they have their legs crossed. But that means in that culture that they are being very attentive. As I have learned it, coming through counseling, that means closed body language. Okay, looking down and arms crossed, legs crossed, you're mad or something's wrong. And you're not paying attention to me, you're ignoring me. Not necessarily the case. So being aware of some of these nonverbals can be very important too. Okay? And then lastly, being able to consult with someone that you trust. If you have a question, go check with someone that you know who might be able to give you some insights into what you're dealing with or what's going on or how it's happening. Again, I've had people that just, walk up to anyone. Hey, I heard this about this person in this group. Tell me about it. And you not just anyone. You don't just walk up to anyone on the street and ask them, and tell them about what you've just learned and is this true or not. Go to people that you trust and that are going to be willing to help you kind of work through anything that you need with regards to any questions that you might have. And you have a lot of resources, of course, right here on this campus. Okay. Now, as we move on into this last area of cross-cultural teaching skills, we have to be aware that we're going to take all that we've learned as far as awareness and take all that we've learned as far as knowledge, and we're going to be very practical now with this information. So in order to be practical, of course, we're going to have to generate information, we're going to have to then communicate it, and then we're going to have to enact it. Okay? So generate, communicate, and enact in order to apply what we have just learned. I wanted to share this quote from Kenneth Dunn, who is in the Ed Leadership Program at Queens College, City University of New York. And he says, if students do not learn the way we teach, then let us teach the way they learn. Okay? If students do not learn the way we teach, then let us teach the way they learn. And I think that this speaks to the flexibility that we need to have as educators. Because again, as you all know, dealing with humans is an inexact science. So we have to be ready for almost anything in the classroom. But we have to be willing, again, to go where our students go as well. Okay? As I talk about some of these implications, again, these are going to be, or this is going to be information that can be used by anyone for any individual in their classroom. But I've just kind of added some information that will speak a little bit more specifically to this area of diversity. And again, a lot of this may just be reiteration for you as we go down the list. But first is to be able to evaluate your teaching and learning methods. Here we have to, of course, keep in mind that, again, teacher expectations can shape the performance of our students, okay? What you're thinking, what you're doing, how you're working in that classroom with your teaching and learning methods truly shapes how your students are learning. So you have to be able to evaluate what you're doing at all times. Again, you have to be varied, you have to be flexible in terms of appealing to a range of ways of learning for your students. You have some students who might learn better by lecture. You have some students who might learn better by watching visual representations, watching multimedia types of presentations. And then you have some students that may learn more when we talk about hands-on techniques. So instead of, for example, just lecturing all the time, in order to reach the strengths of the students who might learn more or learn better in other ways, you kind of mix things up a little bit so everyone has an opportunity, okay? Again, don't assume that everyone learns the way that you do or underestimate students because they don't learn the way that you do. And I have some thoughts here about, ways that we can approach that in the classroom. For example, Socratic dialogue or, some critical thinking, asking questions of students very critically can be helpful. Putting students in groups, particularly if you're having large classes, to give them a voice and give more people an opportunity to participate. Have your students do some teaching in your class. And this has become very popular over the last several years, but having service learning opportunities, people actually going out into the field and working with others can be a very powerful teaching and learning experience. Understanding various power dynamics in your classroom in order to avoid the perpetuation of bias. So again, who are you calling on when students are raising their hands? Who are you tending to avoid when students raise their hands, for example? How are you using your power in your own classroom? Okay? Use it positively and not negatively. And if you're not already familiar with technology, again, always be ready to learn what's new, what's up and coming, so that you can connect with students as well. Okay. Assess curriculum and methods for accuracy and bias. So for example, you can ask yourself about, the textbooks that you use, or you can even question some of the textbooks that you use. Is the language in that textbook respectful? Is the language limiting? Okay, those are questions that you can ask. Are historical references in that textbook accurate? Do examples draw from more than one cultural group? Okay? So again, always assessing what you're using and how you're using it. Is it inclusive or more inclusive than not? You can get together with other TAs in order to critique what you're doing. That can be very helpful. And also, if you're willing to get feedback from students at various points in your class, that can be very helpful as well. Sometimes people will wait until the very end of the semester, and then they'll, of course, have evaluations, and then the thought is that those evaluations, the information that comes from them, can help me in my next semester's class. You can be helping your students in the semester if you're checking with them on how things are going periodically throughout the semester, so that you can have time to correct anything that needs correcting, okay? But if you're able to solicit and accept their feedback, that can be a very helpful tool. Make the examples that you use culturally relevant. And it's very important, of course, to include your experiences in the classes, should that be appropriate for that particular class, but yours isn't the only experience. So also make sure you're hearing from the students in your class in terms of their perspectives, and you're listening to their voices. Being available is very important. And you also can think about expanding your role. Sometimes we're not just teaching assistants. Sometimes we're coaches. Sometimes we're mentors. We might be more than just teachers. So make sure that you are as available as you can be as you're working with students. And I think that when we talk about teaching characteristics that are going to enhance our teaching, regardless of individuals' backgrounds, we know that a teacher who is persistent in helping students is wonderful, okay? That's what people can be looking for. A teacher who is a coach versus someone who's directive and telling you what to do all the time can be very helpful as well, okay? So be available and have an attitude where you want everyone to succeed in your classroom. And then lastly, know the resources that are here at UTSA. For example, I know yesterday on your agenda, I saw that you had presentations by disability services and counseling services and the writing programs, for example. So that's wonderful. You have some background there. You can know where to turn for yourself and even your students should that be needed. We also on this campus have the Inclusion and Community Engagement Center, which is involved in a lot of activities over the course of the year, and those activities speak to diversity in a broad way on our campus. So it's not just dealing with ethnic and racial issues, but also dealing with gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgendered issues, which is where the Allies program comes in, as well as others. And that's a program that you may want to look into, the Allies program, where we can talk about being sensitive to the issues of sexual minority students. And so that program will run you through training and teach you what you need to know and how you need to best interact and how you can be open in dealing with persons of this background. So again, be aware of resources on the campus. All right. So that is cultural diversity in a nutshell as we think about applying that in the teaching scenario. So I want to open up the floor now and see if you have any questions, see if you have any comments, see if you have any experiences that you've had in your classroom that we can look at. Mm-hmm.
If you have a kid in your classroom, like his biological sex is a male,
Mm-hmm.
but like his gender is feminine, and like he's being like picked on or bullied, like how would you intervene to like help that student out?
Okay, and do you mind if I just kind of throw that out? We'll kind of, because we have a little time to throw that out and get some ideas. If you have a student in your class who is
Sex is a male, but his gender is feminine.
sex is a male, but gender is female, that student's being bullied in the classroom by others, what do you think we need to do? How do we need to approach that? Or how might you all approach it? What do you think? Bullying in the classroom.
I would let the bully know that what he's doing is inappropriate and he needs to stop. And if it persists, just ask him to leave.
Okay, so letting the individual who's doing the bullying know that that behavior is not acceptable and it needs to stop. Okay? How about anyone else? Uh-huh.
I would put something in the syllabus to let the students start reading, and that kind of behavior will be tolerated.
All right. So start from the very beginning before class even starts to have that there for everyone to read.
And then if it happens, then
You can refer back to that and then, speak to this behavior. Okay? So, and that's, you both have highlighted things that would need to be done. But again, when we talk about expectations, letting students know up front what you're going to be doing in your class, how you're going to be doing it, what you tolerate, what's not going to be tolerated. To put that in your syllabus can be very helpful. And then you refer back to that. Okay? How about anyone else? Uh-huh. Yes.
All right. Let's say as TAs, like teaching a class, and there's people of a particular group or whatever, they sort of address to each other like by certain words or phrases that may not necessarily be offensive to them themselves, but somebody else in that class could be offended, whether or not they're part of the group.
Mm-hmm.
Should we approach that so that people
Okay.
can be offended anymore?
Okay, I'm writing that down. Right before I get to that, I want to make sure that we catch this, make sure that everything on this first question has been taken care of, and then I'm going to come right to that question. Okay? So any other thoughts with regards to, again, how we might handle that bullying, and then we'll go to language in the classroom. Uh-huh.
Wouldn't that be against the student code of conduct as well?
Yes?
So you can refer back to that?
You can refer back to that too. Again, the way that people put together their syllabi can be very different too. Some people might want to, be more specific and add that, but that would be covered in a very general way by that. Mm-hmm.
Consult with the victim.
Okay, so don't forget that the person who's being bullied needs to have some attention as well.
And get their input on how they might like you to proceed.
Okay, especially if that person has come to you. If not, and if you're seeing it happening, you might take one approach. But if that person's coming to you, to check and see, how best that individual might want you to go about dealing with the situation. Okay, but I think as we look at that, just right up front, to be able to let the students know, what will be tolerated in your class and what won't, and this is a behavior that won't, and then go from there. Is that helpful? Okay. Let me. Uh-huh.
Sorry, just one more. If it doesn't help, you can deal with it and make it continue.
Again, you're going to take that in level. So if just referring back to the syllabus and so forth and so on does not work, then you're going to take the next steps. Maybe that person's going to need to be meeting with you for some more explicit information about what this is going to mean and what this isn't going to mean. And if they continue on, then there might be various channels that you're going to have to take that through in terms of the university and civil, how people are acting civilly or uncivilly in your classroom, and where that might go. That might have to be, how am I trying to say this? We might have to take that to another level in terms of administration to have that addressed. Okay.
That can be considered hazing.
Yes.
Student can take that to.
Yes. Mm-hmm. And that would be when I say the administration route. Yeah, judicial affairs may be that last place to go. Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. So next we had a question that dealt with how do you handle students who are sitting in your class, they're from one group, they might be calling each other names that are okay within that group or that seem to be okay within that group, but may be offensive to others around them. What do you do? And is that I'll just use, because this is what happens, this has come up in other classes that I've taught, and this issue of the N-word. You know, people might be using the N-word within group, but other people outside of the group are not allowed to use that word. But everyone might find it offensive, okay? Is that what you might be, kind of?
Well,
We were talking about, that's an
example.
example. So what about that kind of an example, that kind of thing? What do you do?
Ask them to refrain from using that word in your classroom.
Okay, that's what, yes, in terms of the language that's appropriate to be used in the classroom, then that's something that we don't use. Okay, so ask people to refrain from using offensive language or language that can be considered offensive. How about anyone else? What else could you do?
I took a class where we talk about issues of race and respect.
Yes.
And so setting the expectation early of a safe environment, a respectful environment, this is a standard for our interaction in this class, really helps to refer back to that, to ask the individual student, in your opinion, is this respectful to the whole?
Okay.
Is this safe for the whole?
Yes.
If it's not, then if someone else is doing that, how would you handle it?
Okay, so creating that respectful environment. Again, a lot of what's coming up is that we're doing this up front before class even starts. You know, this is in our syllabus, or when class starts, we're letting people know how we're going to be handling these kinds of things and how we want to, you know, be very mindful of the language that we use, again, because it can hurt others, all right? And for me, you know, when that kind of situation comes up for my class, I am just upfront with it. I think it's a toxic word. Sometimes people think, well, you know, you're black, that must mean that it's okay for you, you know, to use the N word, or you agree with it. No, I mean, like we said, everyone's different. You know, within group, there are more within group differences than between group. I'm one who believes that that N word is a toxic word, and so I'll let people know that, and then speak to this issue of respectfulness and understanding how people can, you know, take offense or not. You have to also know your audience when you're speaking about and where you're speaking these words, and to whom you're speaking these words. So you have to know your audience too. Okay? All right. Any other thoughts? Any other questions about cultural issues?
How do you respect people's diversity and but still sort of maintain, you know, like if people are speaking a different language in your group and, you know, amongst each other, you don't understand it, you don't know if they're confused about the material or if they're just, you know, having their own private conversation. How do you handle that sort of situation?
Okay, so if you have a group and people are speaking
A different language.
a different language
Non-English.
in the group, and you're not sure of what is being talked about, how do you handle that language? Okay, language in the classroom. If someone is speaking a different language, what do you all think about that? If you as a teacher want to know, you know, or make sure that you know what's going on, or that everyone is understanding, how might you all handle that one? Or-
Could you ask if their question is their discussion is related to the topic of your lecture? Or?
Okay, so if students are speaking to check in another language, just to check in with them in that group to find out if,
Just directly ask them if their discussion is related.
okay, is the discussion that you're having related to what we're talking about in the classroom? Okay, all right. What else?
Elementary with little kids, one of the goals that helps is to let the students talk to each other and do some kind of group check.
Okay.
Where you find out how we're doing as a group, and if you're still not sure, talk to the individual student. Because sometimes it's social, or sometimes they're clarifying a concept, and then
Okay, so what you're saying, it might be easier for people to process some of the information going on in class in their own language, but then bringing them back at the end of class or whenever you're going to come together in a larger group to speak to, the issues and what came up for your group, how did you all deal with this, so forth and so on. So yes, bringing it back then to the central question that you ask to check in with that group, okay, and the rest of the groups in the class as well. Okay, how about any other thoughts? Mm-hmm.
Maybe this is a signal that your lecture is really boring.
Okay,
So
now that's,
maybe that's to make a break or make some kind of issue like a joke or funny story to pay attention to you at first and then go on with your lecture.
okay. And you make a point there in terms of, again, being very mindful about how your classroom interactions are going. And also we talked about that awareness piece, taking into account how you're coming across to your classroom. Might this tend to be, something that, maybe they're just off track because I'm off track or what? So just being very mindful of the environment and checking on all parts of things like you've highlighted, because it could be you, is what you're saying, as a teacher.
Yes, sure. It was in my class, and actually this had spoken in Spanish, and I'm teaching static and dynamics. It's really boring for many of students. I tried to pay attention to the formulas, but nothing happened. And then I tried to talk with them in English. How do you think? What I'm going to do with this problem? And they just stop. They just look at me, and I'm trying to make conversation with that person, and that really helps. They stop speaking in their language, and they trying to think something to solve the problem.
Okay. All right. So again, to go around to the various groups and ask pointed questions too, to kind of interrupt that. If you find that it might be, they just might be off track versus discussing what you're talking about, can be helpful as well. So
Yes,
asking pointed questions, as has been highlighted.
Can I ask them to have their places separately for another lesson? Is it appropriate or not?
Okay. Is it appropriate to change up the classroom seating arrangement?
Yes.
Oh, everybody said yes. That can be appropriate. I mean, to ask, and again, when you're getting people into groups or I'd like you all to work with people that you don't know. Excuse me, I'm getting so excited up here. Oh, I love cultural diversity. Okay.
When I'm starting my lecture, actually students prefer to sit with their
Yes.
with their friends, with their neighborhood that they can share something to talk. So probably I have some kind of issue to say, okay, students, just do another thing. We are sitting like a room. Just do it like round and change the seats.
Yes.
Like I like it.
Uh-huh. Yeah, so again, for today, what we're going to do is we're going to get in groups, and I'd like you to get in groups with people that you don't know. I'd like you to work with people this way versus, the persons that you're sitting beside. That mixes things up a little bit. It's not saying that you have to necessarily have them changing every week, because, they might be comfortable sitting with their friends. But sometimes, there's nothing wrong with mixing that up a little bit. Okay? All right. How about anyone else? With any other questions or comments? No? All right. Well, I thank you all so much. I appreciate your attention. And if you do have any questions, please feel free to contact me. I'd be more than happy to speak with you on the issues. So thanks again.